Hi, everyone, and welcome to Alpine Intel's The Savvy Adjuster podcast, where we discuss the property loss topics important to adjusters with the experts who know them best. I'm your host, Senior Account Manager Chris Nichols. Alpine Intel is an industry leader in property assessments and innovation through our operating brands, HVACI, StrikeCheck, National Fire Experts, Donut Engineering, and of course, the Component Testing Laboratory. You can find out more information about these service offerings and, of course, additional resources at our website, alpineintel.com, which is also going to be linked in the show notes. We're here today to share key points with insurance professionals about a variety of property topics, including today's focus, which is CAT investigations. A quick disclaimer before we get started. We're going to be talking today in general investigation and insurance terms. Each property failure is obviously unique, which is why it's so important to get an assessment to make sure you have all the facts for your claims. I am thrilled to be joined today by Alpine Intel's technical education trainer, Kevin Hulsman, who joined us on our debut episode about wind damage to asphalt shingles, and also Donan principal forensic engineer, John Miller. Thanks to the both of you for being here today.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Kevin, let's start with you. Can you give me a little bit of background, if people don't already know, about your experience with, not only just the industry in general, but CAT events and claims?
Sure. So I got my start right after college in the contracting world. So I was in sales and general contracting for that big box retailer for roughly 10 years. I handled pretty much everything exterior installation related, things like roofing, siding, windows, fencing, all the stuff that gets damaged by a lot of CAT events. Ultimately, after 10 years, to change direction and got hired into the insurance industry, where I joined one of the major carriers and their CAT team directly. And I worked with them for 5 years, chasing the weather all over the lower 48 states, lived in Marriott hotels and out of national rental cars for basically 6 months out of the year. So traveled all over the place. And when I wasn't traveling, I was a desk adjuster, handling CAT volume, supplementation, things like that. And now I get to help adjusters with their claims and their claims process here at Alpine, so get to develop training, especially the CAT topics are so specific, as far as what people are looking for, damage profiles, and I'm sure we'll get into it later on today to how to kind of tackle a catastrophe event. So appreciate you having me back on.
Yeah, well, and again, thanks for joining us yet again for another episode of the Savvy Adjuster podcast. Now, John, your expertise is a little more on the technical side of things. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I've been an engineer for almost 40 years. Started doing forensic engineering for Donan 16 years ago. And cut my teeth when we started doing hurricanes and floods, pretty much near the beginning of my tenure with Donan when we were growing nationally. And over time, I've responded to hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, landslides, pretty much anything you can think of all across the country. So to the point where over time, I've now am the person on the technical side with the engineers most responsible for planning, organizing, and responding to our CAT events. A lot of that has to do with training engineers for just events in general, but also for specific events. Every storm has a unique quality to it that we train to.
Well, between you and Kevin, we are in good hands today. Certainly, two experts on CAT investigations. So let's jump right in. I'd like to start off by kind of actually defining what we mean when we say CAT, and we can start with you, Kevin. Obviously, you talked to it a couple minutes ago, but with your background on the carrier side of things, being a member of the CAT team, how did you internally define what CAT was?
I think the insurance industry is probably going to, forgive the pun, but categorize these a little bit differently. Each carrier might have its own take on it. But general guardrails for what a catastrophe event is. A lot of times it boils down to the amount of damage. A lot of the key indicators for some of the Department of Insurance indicators are like 25 million or more in potential damage. Some even lists maybe, unfortunately, fatalities or injuries. And then on maybe like a carrier specific level, they may declare a catastrophe internally if they expect thousands of claims from a single event, like 2,000, 3,000 from a specific derecho event or a hurricane. So, yeah, I think that's going to depend on who's asking and who's defining it. And, John, I'm not sure, John, if we've got any catastrophe related thresholds, but I'll let you speak to that.
So for Donan specifically, for us, a catastrophic event is a lot of times has to do with how many people we have to move, equipment we have to move. So it's very similar to the insurance industry, but we don't have a specific count of projects we have or the dollar amount. You have an event in Florida where we have a fairly large head count. We may be able to handle a small hurricane without moving people around. But if you go to a part of the country where, it's not that populated, we don't have that many people, we may have to move a good number of people to respond to that event. So that's one of our things. But we often follow the lead of the insurance industry in terms of what we call a CAT. We think about, but also in terms of planning is more than just, the business end of it. It's anticipating what might happen. So we look at all natural disasters and man-made disasters and try to determine, we may not go into CAT mode, but we will think about it. So for example, just a couple of days ago, Houston had what's been officially defined as a derecho, which has a very specific meaning for the National Weather Service. So it's a wind event that encompasses, I think, 240 miles of winds over 50 miles an hour, I think maybe a little bit higher. So obviously it hit downtown Houston, the dollar amount's going to go quite high. So for me and my planning, that's a CAT event, whether there's a lot of work or not, because it's, there we have to start thinking about, do we have enough people there? What kind of work are we going to get? Do we have the training in place? Is everybody trained to the types of work that we would have to do? You can, anything from hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, earthquakes, natural disasters, but man-made disasters. What would be a catastrophic event would be the ship that struck the bridge in Baltimore. That's a natural disaster, or a man-made disaster rather, but it's not going to involve us and not something we would look at. Versus not many months ago, we had a house explosion somewhere in Pennsylvania. I can't remember exactly where it affected several hundred houses. And so we don't go officially into CAT mode and start scheduling people, but we actually respond to that. We do the research on it and we track it. So, we want to make sure that the right people get out there, but also that any training we need to do is in place before we start looking at the work.
Awesome. And just to speak as a member of the sales team as well, I know we're really good at obviously watching weather and reaching out to our carrier partners to determine if they are expecting an influx of claims so we can allocate resources appropriately. So sounds like there's some similarities between not only the carrier side, but also the supplier side as well. But Kevin, next question, I'll kind of shoot over to you from your experience. What should carriers do to make sure they're really ready to handle an influx of claims when a CAT event does happen?
Yeah, and we'll probably have to speak in a lot of big, broad terms here, but I think the biggest thing is have a plan. I mean, you just heard John talk about, what we do, and compared to a huge carrier, we're pretty small, but we have a plan. So I think a lot of these carriers, especially like the middle size to larger carriers, are going to have some kind of their own forecasting, whether that's actual weather forecasting specifically. But what they're trying to do is anticipate that claim volume. And the keys really seem to kind of be to predict what might happen so that they can have their assets like staged up or on call when that weather actually hits, so that you're not like on your heels trying to react to an event that's already taken place. So to give you an example, like the carrier that I worked for, they had a full-time CAT team. So I, as a CAT team member, was expected to be ready to travel to one of these sites within 24 to 48 hours, which means I could potentially be on site inspecting claims within 2 to 4 days following that weather event. I mean, that takes massive planning and coordination. to get done. Now, when it comes to some of these smaller carriers, a lot of times what they're doing is they're calling up their local field adjusters. Like, well, welcome to the majors. You get called to the show, but they get called to do cat duty, where they might have to sign up for like a couple of weeks every year to be on call to potentially go to these events. IA partners are huge when it comes to cat work. So these carriers have to have agreements in place with some of these IA firms to say, hey, if we get a major derecho event in Houston, how many claims can you guarantee that you can take on, and what service agreement do you have for responding to those things? So that all goes back to the planning side of things. Like, you have to have a plan. You can't afford to just wait for it to happen and figure it out. So I think the same thing too comes to vendors and whatnot. If you're a carrier, who can you rely on to show up with you essentially and be ready for these things? And that kind of circles back to what John was saying as far as, hey, we're ready. We're getting ready with the vendors. We're getting ready with the carrier, excuse me.
Yeah, and John, anything to add to Kevin's answer, or maybe some thoughts on how Donut Engineering prepares for CAT events on our side of things?
Yeah, so the first step is the long range planning. So the key things there for us would be, for example, licensure in specific states. Sometimes getting additional engineering licenses can be time consuming. It's also expensive. And so we look at specific types of events, especially hurricanes. And, everywhere from typically Virginia all the way over to Texas, before every season, we're doing a head count and how many licenses do we have in each one of these states. And of course, every storm that occurs gives us a historical model of what can happen next. So we do have a decent idea of not only how many engineers we're going to need at the peak, but how many we're going to need over the next 6 months to a year, because for us, these events go on for a long period of time. So the second part of long-range planning is training. So we do very, very specific in-house training on many topics, especially flood and hurricanes. So we need to make sure not only those engineers licensed in specific places, but they have the proper training. And we don't want to try to wait to the last minute to do that. So, not just for flood, which, has its own unique properties, but hurricane, wind versus water. And every particular event has its own, type of training. We have earthquake training, we have tornado training, things that you should expect to see, and that kind of thing. So that's the first part. The second part is just like the carriers would do, is we're watching the weather, we're forecasting. And, that's more specifically to hurricanes, but also floods. We're looking at, Texas has been wet for quite a while, and every new storm that comes through is adding to already high water levels. So we know that we should expect ongoing flooding. And we've seen that before in Texas, where in May we have major floods, and then a month later in June we have major floods. So we're kind of looking at that in terms of staffing and training. And then there's the short-term planning, where we get into, okay, we have a hurricane, we expect it to make landfall in 3 days. At that point, we start making schedules, moving equipment, renting hotel rooms, moving vehicles, just like the carriers normally do. And when we build a schedule, what's a little bit different for us is it's usually a week to 2 weeks before we get on the ground. The adjusters have to get out there first and decide when they need engineers. So we know there's a lag, but our peak tends to be 3 to 4 weeks after landfall or the storm occurrence before we start peaking. And again, we look at every past storm and we try to find an analogy to the current one. And we then predict how many engineers we're going to need week 1, 2, 3 for the next 3 months. And we actually schedule for that. And then over those 3 months, we'll schedule out the next 3 months and then for the full year, because typically we'll still respond to an event 2 years out. So that's a big deal. And, I take a lot of pride in that we've gotten very good at that. So like when Irma hit in Southwest Florida, we really nailed exactly how many jobs we were going to get. I mean, not say exact, but we were never more than 2 weeks out from being on site from getting a job. In fact, we were often still scheduling jobs for next week, this week, because we had put enough resources out there that we were able to get to the job quickly. And that's what's important to our clients, is us getting to the job quickly and obviously turning a report around quickly. So we base a lot of our planning on trying to meet our clients' needs.
Well, and with Donan's vast experience, 75 plus years, I'm sure we've got a pretty big database of data to help guide those decisions. As far as we've seen this 5 years ago, we saw this 10 years ago. It certainly helps. Kevin, you'd mentioned something earlier about time to site, right? 24 to 48 hours. And on a previous episode of the podcast, we were talking to two of our lead fire investigators, and obviously with fire claims, that's very important, right? Spoliation of evidence, getting there on time. They both had go bags. I'm just curious, when you were on the CAT team, do you have a physical duffel bag with toothbrush and toiletries ready to go when you were working CAT claims?
I had two separate sets of clothing and gear. Like I had my home stuff, and then I had two suitcases that never got unpacked when I got home. Oh, lie. So the laundry got done, but they went right back into the suitcase. And those are just always ready to go. And flying most places, I had 50-pound limit? Yeah, I had 100 pounds worth of stuff. And I think I could pack those two suitcases within a few ounces of 100 pounds to make sure I had both stuff that's important to get the job done, but also since you're living out of a hotel, you have like just, the basics to make it not feel like you're living out of a hotel 6 months out of the year. But yes, go bags were definitely one of those things. And mine was 2 rolling duffel bags and my backpack and a drum.
The drum is the interesting that I'm assuming a literal drum,
Drone, like a
drone. Sorry, I thought you said drum, and I knew you were a musician
Ah,
from just personal conversation, so I thought you brought your own drum with
That
maybe
would- that would make me very popular with the other hotel guests, but no, drone, yeah.
Got it. I'm glad I clarified. Although I kind of wish you would bring your own drum. That would be kind of cool. So
No, I feel like I missed out on an opportunity, so.
yeah, there you go. Well, we'll stick with you, Kevin, on the next question. So, and again, this is just kind of in your opinion from your experience, but are there certain things that separate, a good vendor for CAT claims versus somebody who you should maybe not so much steer clear of, but maybe a little bit more difficult vendor?
Yeah, I mean, with catastrophe work, it's volume claim handling. How fast can you get there? How fast can you inspect? Not how fast can you inspect? How quickly can you turn around an estimate to get, somebody who's having probably the worst month of their life, try to get them back to normal. So anybody who's willing to support me in that effort is awesome. And then anybody who gets in the way of me, handling these claims is a liability. And so for me, it was companies that I had previous relationships with, whether it was on the last CAT tour or whether it was somebody that already had a partnership with the carrier that I worked for. They said, "Hey, listen, like these are the assets you guys have to settle these claims efficiently." And I'm like, "Yes, please. Anybody who can take something off my desk and make my life easier, I'm 100% going to use it." And so things that were what's important to everybody, but important to me was how quickly can you get there? And then when you do get there, put your nickel down. Tell me what you think. I'm paying you for your opinion. Tell me exactly, and I'll be specific. I'll tell you exactly what I'm looking for. And so, especially when it came to technical stuff like heating and air conditioning equipment, like I don't know anything about that, or I didn't at that time. Or if it was a surge event like we had in we just Port Houston, that pipe freeze event, there was, a million surge claims from that. Like I don't have a multimeter. I'm not going to test whether or not your TV is actually damaged by this surge. So any technical stuff that I can get off my desk, I don't have to guess on it, or I don't have to like personally spend days researching what may or may not be damaged. I'm signing up for that immediately. So those things that the carriers allow their adjusters to use, that was something I was always trying to do, is get stuff off of my desk, or if I was my claim still, get it into the expert's hands as quickly as possible.
Well, it sounds like, again, to reference the large loss fire podcast that we did, they kept on hammering the fact that communication is key because it's such a large event, right? You have so many working pieces, so many people involved. Can you kind of speak to speak to that a little bit about how communication is key, and as far as on site, all of these different people that you are coordinating with, if you will.
Yeah, the large loss fires, just think of like 60 to 100 of each one of those events. That's a cat tour. You've got potentially 50 to 100 claims that you've been assigned, and each one of them has its own group of people and its own the insureds that you have to communicate with. And then if you have vendors that are helping you with it, you have all of those people to communicate with too. So communication is paramount, and having a system for you as an adjuster to kind of to get to all of that, and to manage that and set good expectations. I think it makes it even more valuable to have a vendor that is a great communicator, that has a well-documented, hey, once you sign up to work with us, these are all the steps that we're going to do, and you don't have to worry about it. And these are the contact points where we're going to reach back out to, either to gather more information or hopefully provide you with the report that you've requested.
Awesome. So John, as far as from the service provider vendor side of things, what should a carrier expect from an assessment from Donut Engineering? Can you kind of go into a little bit of detail on that?
Yeah, so I would hammer home the communication thing. Clear, concise, current communication is critical. For example, not just on the specific project, the engineers should be touching base with the adjusters, before and after they look at it, especially if there's any issues going on. But just between the vendor itself and the carriers, there needs to be communication. For example, we are very quick to let carriers know what our capacity is as soon as we can figure it out where it is. We're also very quick to let the carriers know how far out we're going to be if they give another job, especially with hurricanes. When you get into really large volume, the reality is there's only so many engineers out there who are proficient at this work. And when you get in a really large event like a Sandy or a Harvey, the odds are everybody's time frames are going to get pushed out. And so having a vendor who's going to be honest with you and up front and say, look, you get us another job, it's going to be 2 weeks, it's going to be 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, this is what we think our volume capacity is going to be. That kind of communication is very critical, and we take that very seriously. So I, on the engineering side, work very closely with the sales team during events to make sure we have that communication. We're also collecting information from the clients, because we may know how bad the hurricane is, but we need to know how many losses there are. And that's going to play right into how many engineers we need. So the communication goes both ways. It's really, really important. But when you get past that, the engineering reports, if you're not getting an accurate, concise, and definitive answer, then something's wrong. That's our job. Now, there are those rare occasions when we don't have enough evidence to reach an answer. We should be very clear. We should be on the phone with you telling you that and what we need to get that answer, or it's just not going to be possible. But that's unusual. So I've seen too many reviewed reports from all over the country, from all kinds of different companies, and you get this vague, imprecise language. And we as forensic engineers, we need to know what you need, what kind of answers you need specifically. Whether or not there's water intrusion as a result of a storm-created opening is a very clear, definitive answer. That's the kind of thing, especially when you get into hurricanes. Going back, you get into those big events like Harvey and with Sandy specifically, going all the way back to Katrina. There's a tendency when there's not enough engineers to start reaching out and using people you don't normally use or don't normally do forensic work. There's a great danger in that. There's a lot of great stories of how that's gone terribly wrong for engineers and insurance companies. So you need to make sure that whoever you're hiring has the skill set and the experience to do forensic engineering. An engineering who knows how to design a multi-story condo building on the beach of Florida is not necessarily competent in doing the forensic investigation of whether the damage is from wind or storm surge. And that makes a big difference. Finally, you need to make sure they're there for the long haul. 6 months from now, or 2 years from now, when this project goes to litigation, you really want those same people, preferably the same engineers, but if not, a lot of the same people who were involved in the original project are still around to answer those questions. And so well-established, firms that have skills are important.
So it sounds like it boils down to really three things: expertise, right, which you were just touching on, having the skill set to be able to handle those, communication, and not only communication but transparency as well, to give timelines of, hey, does this meet your needs? Because they want to obviously help their customers as quickly as possible. So that transparency is key from our end, and then actionable reports, right? Reports that actually tell you what you need, to know and get you the facts. So, so that's great. Well, Kevin, and again, a opinion question here, but smaller carriers versus larger carriers, I don't know if there's really any difference on what the steps they need to take, but kind of in your opinion, are there different steps that, say, a smaller carrier versus a larger carrier need to take in a CAT event?
Again, we talked about a little bit of preparation when it came down to just in general how carriers should do it. I think smaller carriers have got more work to do on the front side to plan for an event, because they may not have the internal resources or the bodies to get out there and inspect these claims. So you've really got to have great relationships with your vendor partners and with IA firms to be ready for these events. Like, all of those things have to be in place. And as these hurricanes approach, specifically like where you stage everybody up, you get in contact with all of your IA firms. You said, hey, we see this thing coming. Are you guys ready to respond? All those things. But the larger carriers, I'm not going to say they have it any easier. They still have internal resources that they've got to move around. So really, I think the process is similar. It's just the smaller carriers may be relying on external partners, and the larger carriers might have a little bit more control because their resources are more internal. But bottom line, they both have to be ready for it. They both have to have plans in place, relationships well established with everybody involved before these events happen. Otherwise, everybody's reacting to these major weather events.
Sure. To go back to you being a specific member of the CAT team, right? That was in your title. You were on the CAT team, but you mentioned being able to pull a carrier, being able to pull from other, say, the desk team or things like that. As far as that goes, we're again, I'm learning new stuff about insurance every single day, but were there a specific kind of varsity and JV team, meaning, there were people on the desk or people maybe in the field that weren't CAT adjusters that were let know, hey, you are part of the kind of backup CAT team, if you will.
Right. John made a great reference to Sandy and to Katrina. At that point, there were people that, from these carriers that were, clerks and people in underwriting. And, sometimes I felt like because of how many claims they got during Sandy, they were pulling, the guy who was running the parking desk at the office building to go look at claims, because everybody was affected. And there were so many claims that they were pulling anybody they could to try to get out and help their clients out. So, that's like a unprecedented event, but I think everybody learned a lot from that and said, hey, we need to have like tiers that say, hey, this is our A team. Like if the carrier that I was with had a major leagues for cats, it was the CAT team, right? And then the feeder leagues were the local adjusters in the different areas of the country, and they could be activated to get called up to that event. And then if it really, really got bad, like a Houston pipe freeze event or a Katrina or an Irma, then they would go and start pulling office staff that had claim background, at least, to help them out. So, yeah, and again, it comes down to planning. These companies have plans for the next wave of people in, depending on how many claims they end up with.
Well, I appreciate you giving me a peek behind the curtain there as far as that, the kind of the inner workings. John, you touched on something earlier as well that I'd like to kind of go back to. So as far as on the Donan engineering side of things, you talked about training and being able to handle specific claims. Can you speak a little bit to the specific training that our experts get to help prepare them for these kind of CAT claims?
Oh, absolutely. I would touch a little bit on what Kevin was talking about in terms of when you get those major events. We do this. Hopefully the insurance companies do. We triage the work, and we know our engineers. We know their capabilities, and we know what training they've already done. So we will parcel out the work based on who the person is. And so, for example, the most complicated, go back to Irma, the condo buildings on the beach that are wind versus water. There's a subset of engineers that we're going to put out there. And then the engineers with less experience or, moving from Minnesota down to Florida and haven't looked at hurricanes before, we're going to have them looking at inland, at roofing. So triaging the work kind of goes right into that training. So specific training, of course we do, we're constantly training. We have a huge library of internal training that we do. I'm constantly creating new training for engineers about these specific events: wind damage to structures, flood damage to structures, earthquake damage to structures. So we constantly, we make all our engineers go through that. Certain types of events, they cannot go out and do that work until they've actually taken and passed these specific classes. So flood and hurricane wind versus water would be two examples that we do. And then in addition to that, so again, we have a long response time. We're out there for months and years. So we take our A team, like Kevin's talking about. They're our first responders. They're first on site. These are guys who have responded to multiple events and know what they're doing and need a minimum amount of training and ready to go. And then during that period, we are training up other engineers. We're taking this opportunity to train people who have not been to one of these events, because the reality is the best time to train someone is right before they need it. You train someone, they don't do it for 2 years, they've forgotten most of it. So we love to train right up to the event. And so even when we take these engineers from Minnesota who've never been to a hurricane, we train them first. Oftentimes we actually have them shadow somebody in the field. And then we actually have sometimes very specific review processes to make sure that they're getting the right answer and providing all the right information. So we're very, very adamant on getting it right the first time. No one wants to go out there a second time. Then in addition to that, every event has some unique quality to it. Go back to Irma again, we saw a lot of those condo buildings, right? Which was the first storm we'd seen anything resembling that many condo buildings. So we did a lot of research, and that's one of the things I do to understand what kind of issues we need to be looking at, making sure we're covering all our bases. But then we saw a lot of claims of ceramic tiles on concrete slabs. I mean, a lot. The flood business was getting lots of claims where the flood water theoretically damaged these ceramic tiles. And so we did a lot of internal training. We solved the issue. We trained up to it. Louisiana, a number of years ago, we saw a lot of windows claims. And we did a lot of research and a lot of training and make sure that we had all the best, most recent information. We were giving it to our engineers and that we were looking at everything properly. We want to make sure we attribute things to the storm that are proper to attribute, but also making sure when there's another cause, or sometimes there's no damage, that we're clear on that. So we will, and every storm is going to be unique in that respect about the kind of issues you're going to deal with. And so we're every storm, I'm actually going through the scopes and looking for things that stand out. And then, like someone like me, not just me, will go out in the field very early on and evaluate, well, here's the kind of stuff we're looking at, and then go back and set up the training so they make sure we do that.
Well, it sounds like when somebody contacts Donan Engineering, they are in good hands and well-trained hands. It sounds like training. Sounds like it's the key there. So to semi-wrap up today's episode, I'm always curious. We got a lot of good information, about how to handle CAT claims, what you need to do to be prepared to handle CAT claims. But I'm always a big fan of real-life examples, if you will, of claims that you've both worked, whether it's a super complex one or one that had some interesting parts to it. Kevin, how about starting us off with an example, from past memory of a CAT claim you've worked that our listeners may find interesting?
I think some of the most memorable CAT claims, probably for me, that stuck with me are the tornado claims. There's something about when a serious tornado touched down, like EF2, EF3, that just kind of sticks with you. It looks like a bomb went off in that small area or sometimes huge area of town. So, the one that sticks out to me was the Easter tornado in Seneca, South Carolina. I was down there just a few days after that event, and there was a neighborhood behind the Berg Warner transmission plant that got wiped out before that tornado hit the Berg Warner plant. And some of the houses were kind of bulldozed over, if you will. Total losses, and then you had the ones just one street over that trees had fallen on it, cut the house nearly in half. And you're just kind of digging out. There's one specifically where the homeowner's like, "Hey, we're not there. We can't stay there. We're running late because of traffic or something. Go ahead and start inspecting." So I roll up to this site. There's a whole bunch of down trees everywhere. There's a couple different houses pretty close to where GPS says this house is supposed to be. So I start inspecting what I think is the house, and then the homeowner shows up half an hour later and they go, "No, not this house here, the house over there." And they pointed to this giant pile of broken and twisted trees. And apparently underneath all of those broken and twisted trees was the small cape that they had luckily, huddled up in during that tornado. And I had to use a drone to fly over the top of this tree mess to even see where the house was in relationship to it. We couldn't even access the house. The firefighters and the police actually cut like a path to the back window where the family was able to escape. So I actually had to go back to that house 2 weeks later after all the trees had been cleared. And we partnered up with an engineering firm on that particular one, and unfortunately the trees had basically destroyed the structural integrity of that block foundation, kind of squished it and twisted it off of its original spot. But that was the first time that I had started inspecting a house and realized that the the one that I was supposed to be looking at was next door, buried in trees. So the tornado ones are unfortunately the most memorable, just because the damage is so violent. So that's probably the one that pops to mind there.
Sure. And John, same question to you. Any investigations you've been a part of that have kind of stood out to you that would be beneficial for our listeners to hear about?
So, I'm absolutely awed by the sheer power that's involved in these events. And, people, before I ever did forensic engineering, people would be quick to tell you that I was always attracted to disasters, usually just because I am one. And it's amazing to see the force and just what nature can do. As an engineer, I find fascinating is getting a little deeper into it and trying to understand why. With tornadoes, as Kevin said, it's not unusual to get severe damage on one house and a neighboring house not to have much damage. And we're like, well, why? So 2011, Alabama, when the entire state was covered with tornadoes, and I was somewhere near Birmingham looking at these two very nice, expensive houses side by side. And one of them had minimal damage, some loss of roof covering and stuff. And then the one beside it, two big dormers that were on the front of the house were laying upside down in the front yard. And then in the front left was the garage and then bonus room on it. And that gable wall was just completely detached and removed from the house. And it's like, why is this house so bad? But when you go in and you look at it in more detail, in this case, those two they were false dormers. So they had decked the roof and then built these dormers on them. So they had windows in them, but no light got into the house. And what they had done is they just run two 2x6s up the roof and put a nail about every 2 or 3 feet in those 2x6s to put the dormers on. They didn't bother to nail them into the rafters or the trusses. They were just going into the decking. And so, these 2x6s might have been 15 more feet long, and they had like 5 nails each or 6 nails each. And so when the tornado hit that, it just ripped that thing off the house. And they're both just laying in the yard. And then the gable wall was the same way. There was a nail every 2 or 3 feet holding that gable wall into the house. And so understanding, it could be wood rot or termite damage. It's like, why is this so bad here and not there? Because especially homeowners that, they go through an event like that and they've got all kinds of people telling them all kinds of things. Your house is racked. It's all leaning one way. It's all twisted. People like talk about tornadoes twisting houses and like, well, it doesn't really work that way. But being able to explain to a homeowner why this part of their house is damaged and the rest is not, or why their house is damaged in their neighbor, or vice versa, coming up, not just saying it is or isn't from the tornado, but being very specifically and hopefully helping people. That person's going to repair those dormers. Hopefully they find a different contractor, because you don't want the same guy building that back. So that's really fun when you get into these odd situations. And sometimes you sit there and scratch your head for a while and you call a few of your buddies and explain the situation and try to figure out what happened here. And it feels good when you actually come up with the right answer that no one else saw, or something like, or just you help somebody down the road.
That's both of those examples are super interesting. I appreciate you both sharing those, and it just speaks to why finding a vendor partner who has expertise, actionable reports, really good at communication is so key. So, well, thank you to the both of you, and Kevin, thanks again for joining us. For yet another episode. I appreciate the time that you guys took today to give us some tips and insight into CAT claims, and obviously thanks to our listeners. You can obviously check the show notes for additional CAT resources, and make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Obviously, you can always visit our website, alpineintel.com. We have a resource library there that has tons of more and additional CAT materials. And Kevin, before we let you go, I know you have a heavy hand in our monthly Alpine Intel webinars, and it sounds like we may have one coming up soon that could be really beneficial for adjusters in regards to CAT claims. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. This is coming up. We host a monthly webinar series. It's open to the general public. It's typically the first or second Wednesday of the month. The next one coming up is actually on tornadoes. So tornado damage to residential structures. And that one's going to be on June 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And actually, John and I partnered up on this webinar to kind of come up with the basics, the adjuster basics for just tornado formation, on what it potentially can do to the typical residential structure. So we'll take a much deeper dive into that. Our website has a spot to register for that particular webinar. And we look forward to seeing many of you, hopefully, on Wednesday the 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Kevin. I've personally sat through a lot of those, and they are very valuable. I know your team puts a ton of work into those webinars as well, and we hear great things from our attendees. So, listener, if you have property claims that need assessments, you can always submit an assignment on our website, or just get more details on how our suite of services can bring you the answers you need to feel confident about your settlement decisions. Again, thanks for joining today, and we will see you next time.